Well, thank you for having me back. This is my second year of being invited to camp. And so, though this is very different sitting in my home office and not being able to see all of your faces and have the exciting energy of camp, I'm very delighted to be back. And as I, thought about my slides for today, I was thinking about last year and the things that I talked about and the things I was invited to talk about. And I took a little different spin on it this year. So um, hopefully this can be, just a nice, uh, validating and useful presentation for you. And I'll be very anxious to be able to hear from all of you later in the panel session with Kyle and Gabe, because I really miss the interactive component of this right now. And let's see, I just need to figure out how to advance my slides. Okay, very well. So generally, when I talk on cultivating well-being and resilience, as you've all heard me talk in the past, my objectives are pretty simple. I like to talk about why well-being is important to your health, as Suzanne alluded to. I like to define well-being in a deeper, more complex way and talk about all the elements that really truly impact well-being, more than just the physical health and wellness aspects that we typically think of. And then I like to give people tools and ideas for how to begin to cultivate well-being in their personal lives on a deeper level. And I often leave people with tips and resources. And so I like to start with this visual image. I am a professor at the University of Minnesota's Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. And there, our director has created this model of well-being, which we use to talk and teach from. So those of you who were at camp last year, this is not new to you. You've seen it before, and you've heard me talk about it before. And I've even seen it shared on FARF's social media. So I know that this is not a new image for you. But as a quick refresher, we define well-being as being very multi-dimensional, having a lot of depth and a lot of different concepts that come together to create well-being in an individual's life. And the most important part about this model for me is noticing that health, or the physical health, is just 1/6 of the total picture. And so that is important because one can have be struggling with their physical health or have relatively poor physical health and still have a fairly strong sense of well-being and resilience, because they can cultivate well-being in all of these other 5 dimensions. And the converse is true. We all know people who are the picture perfect health in terms of maybe eating really well and working out in the absence of disease, and something's just not right in terms of their well-being picture. They're missing something else, whether it's they're struggling with relationships or a sense of purpose. I think, I'm going to talk more about the impacts of social media later on in the talk, but I really think this digital age that we're living in and this world of social media and social media influencers has done a really good job of confusing us all when it comes to this picture of well-being, because people curate this perfect or so-called perfect image of themselves, and it gets projected out there. And it's a really good way to start comparing ourselves and questioning ourselves and wondering why this sense of well-being is so easy for some, yet I'm sitting here scrolling through my news feed and struggling so much. And it sort of just creates a clouded picture that isn't always very useful. So, in short, how we define well-being is that it is, a sense of happiness, healthiness, prosperity, a state of feeling in balance and alignment, or feeling whole is often a shortened way to say that. It's a state of contentment and peacefulness. And importantly, it's being connected to purpose, a sense of purpose, what gets you out of bed in the morning, not just, in the literal sense, but really what keeps you going, what do you live for, what do you fight for, and identifying that and tuning into that, tapping into that, and using that as a motivating factor in life. Well-being means to have, a sense of harmony about the way you go through life, and a sense of safety and security, which is important in a lot of senses, and certainly an area that we've all been more in tune with in recent weeks and world events. So, you may be expecting my normal well-being and resilience spiel, a talk similar to what you heard last year. And as I looked through those slides and I thought about the things I normally talk about, I thought to myself, I would be tone deaf to not mention the elephant in the room. Our world has changed a lot in the last few months, and the challenges that we're all facing these days are new and different and amplified and big and hard. And so I decided to take today's talk a little different direction. And I hope that that's a good direction and not a challenging direction. And hopefully you're not all sick of hearing about the current world events that we're struggling with. But we're certainly living in a day and age where we're facing a couple of different pandemics. We're facing a fight for human life everywhere, a fight for justice. Most notably, we're facing COVID-19, and we have been. We're in, kind of our third or fourth month, depending on where you live and when it started to hit your area. And so that new reality has really started to sink in, to settle in. It's not just a media buzz anymore. It really is a way that we're living our lives. And then we have human rights issues that are, really happening every single day and on multiple levels. And there's far too many for me to name them all. But as many of you know, I'm located in Minneapolis. And so certainly the murder of George Floyd is heavy on all of our hearts. And we've lived through a humanitarian crisis and some unprecedented times here in our city. And as sick as we all are of that word unprecedented, there really isn't another word for what we're living through right now. And those two issues are really only the tip of the iceberg. It's not new. It didn't start with George Floyd. And I recognize and honor that many of our FA families are not just FA families, but you may be a member of another group that's also fighting for human rights of some sort. And it is hard to find your place in that fight and your voice in that fight in, a so-called normal world. And it's very challenging in the midst of a pandemic and sorting through the things that are occurring on social media and the protests and the peaceful demonstrations. And I just want to acknowledge that it's a really hard time to find your place in this world in general. And then if you have this big red stop sign in the middle of the slide, I imagine you're probably searching at an even deeper level to find your place in all of the unrest and just sort of the energetic intensity of our world right now. And if all that weren't enough, the world feels shut down. Human connection feels shut down. So our typical coping mechanisms, maybe being together with friends or reaching out to distant family, just simply getting a hug, feeling some sense of human connectedness is not necessarily accessible to us right now. Social distance is sort of an unfortunate misnomer because though we have to practice physical distancing right now, it's that social distancing that's hard to work with and live with. And whether you're introverted or extroverted, this has changed the way that you live and has been a certainly isolating experience. And I have a picture of social media as part of this collage because that tends to be the default mode of connection for better or for worse in these times. And that's a difficult energy to live with and to wrestle with as we strive to maintain a sense of well-being. So if we think back to the 6 elements of well-being that I had on the second slide, the sense of community, the sense of purpose, relationships, all of those pieces of well-being are very tied into everything that's happening in our world right now. So how do we make sense of it all? I'm so curious to hear from all of you how you're making sense of it all. Figuring out what is normal, what is abnormal, what did normal feel like, what does getting back to normal mean? One thing I've certainly heard from the FA families that I stay in close touch with is there was this immediate sense of, the rest of the world is finally having to live like we've been living for years, especially if you've been through a BMT, right? So there's this sort of initial sense of like, oh, this is actually just pretty normal for us. But then there's these added layers of complications. And, it's not normal for anyone, and it's not going to be normal for a really long time. And so we're just left to sit and make sense with all of it as it relates to our well-being and our resilience. So as the rest of the world is already starting to get back to normal, even New York is starting to get back to normal, and people have started to get back to normal around Memorial Day in a lot of states, and now we're upon another holiday. You may be thinking, where does this leave me and my family? Because certainly the pandemic is not over yet, and getting back to normal doesn't mean that it's safe for anyone out there. And in fact, if you are immune compromised, you may be thinking that the world is an even scarier and more dangerous place for you right now as everyone moves on. And then that can be a really hard feeling to sit with. Like everyone else gets to move on and you don't. And maybe you feel like you need to shelter in place even more or be even more cautious, because certainly we've seen an increase in cases as everyone starts to get back to normal, whatever normal means. And so this reality, this back and forth and push and pull over simple things like wearing a mask, that must seem, on the best days humorous to some of you who have spent so many months and weeks and months and even years in a mask, and on the worst days probably fairly infuriating. And you're just trying to make sense of it and do what's right for yourself and for your family. And that's a really deep thing to reckon with, is in terms of your own well-being. And then the media is inundating us all with facts, not fear, and how to get back to normal and what to know about COVID. And it's a moving target. As a healthcare professional who consider myself, pretty tuned in and well-read and working hard to keep up on the situation and fielding questions for both FA families, but also other patients and families that I work with. And there aren't easy answers, and there sometimes aren't a lot of facts yet for COVID-19. And so that's a difficult energy to work with and then manage what's out there in the most reliable places, and then also facing social media and myths and news sources that aren't very factual. So I want to kind of shift gears after that sort of long-winded preface to my acknowledgement of the world that we're living in and the sort of the state of what you're all grappling with as you think about well-being and resilience. And I want to bring your awareness to an article that was published in the Star Tribune, our Minneapolis newspaper, sort of more towards the beginning or maybe the middle of when COVID-19 was ramping up. I think the date on this article is May 1st. And the title is, "It's Okay Not to Be Okay." And so I guess maybe stealing from this article, that's a little bit the theme of my talk today. I didn't come here with answers. I didn't come here with a slideshow full of all the things that you can do to really bolster your well-being and get through these tough times. I think I came here to bring to you hopefully some validation and maybe some kind of themes and ways to name some of what you might be experiencing and feeling that's deeply impacting your well-being. So one of the things that struck me when I found this article and started reading it, I just want to take a moment to share with you a direct quote out of this article that felt so very real to me. It says, "It's as if this turned up the gravity on the planet. For those people, whatever they were trying to do feels harder and heavier now. Now we see the pressure to make something positive out of the situation, get that sourdough started, read those books. It's wonderful for those who can use those things as coping mechanisms, but a lot of people feel like they can't, and they feel like a failure, and that's part of what's making it toxic. And so I want to spend a minute talking about this concept of toxic positivity. And I want to be clear that I think this is a concept that this audience really already gets on a deep, deep level. And I've learned a fair amount about toxic positivity from working with individuals like yourselves and these families like yourselves. And I'm not sure that you always have the words to label it or the validation that's a real thing and it's detrimental to your well-being. So toxic positivity is a relatively new concept in the psychology literature. And it's defined as the excess and ineffective overgeneralization of a happy, optimistic state across all situations. It results in denial, minimization, invalidation of the authentic human emotional experience. And this is when I really wish we were in person, because I'd really like to ask you all to raise your hand and tell me if you've ever felt this way and when and what it felt like and how and what it was that made you feel like you were experiencing toxic positivity. But maybe we'll hear about that a little more in the panel. But another, this picture I think is another great way of understanding toxic positivity. It's all the messages that we get all the time to be #grateful, #thankful, #blessed. It's the kind of flippant, ineffective, Pollyanna message that it'll all be okay if we just slap on a smile and get through another day. And if you're an individual that has challenges in life, and I don't know an individual who doesn't, these messages aren't very helpful, and they're often not coming from a very real place or a very helpful place, though not always malicious in nature. They're not very tuned in to sometimes where you're at as an individual. And so if it feels sometimes like you're being trampled by this sense of positive messaging or toxic positivity, it's pretty real, and it's pretty normal for that to not feel good. So if you look into kind of the literature and the writings in the psychology profession around toxic positivity, these are the kind of 7 telltale signs that you're experiencing toxic positivity. So it boils down to things like, being made to feel like you have to hide or mask your true feelings. If you're trying to, just get on with it and dismiss an emotion, feeling guilty about what you feel, feeling like your experiences are minimized, or, people minimizing you with the feel-good quotes or statements, the blanket canned expressions that don't feel useful. And even perspectives like, well, it could be worse, instead of validating that it is pretty bad and it is pretty hard, validating that a real emotional experience that you're having. Shaming or chastising, feeling shamed for expressing frustration or basically any emotion that isn't, positive, or feeling like you're just having to brush off things that are bothering you with that kind of "it is what it is" type of attitude, and just accepting that and shoving that and not experiencing that. So these are kind of the the ways that that toxic positivity has entered the scene. So in short, it's basically a way of shutting you up. If life isn't easy for you, and life isn't, dreamy and social media worthy all the time, and you're being made to feel like you just have to shut your mouth and deal with it and get on with it, that's experiencing toxic positivity. And it's a tough place to be. So the consequences then of toxic positivity is that it leaves people feeling shameful. And when you feel shame, you feel like you have 2 choices. You can either be really brave and honest about what you're experiencing, which takes a lot of courage, whether it's face-to-face or on social media, or you can pretend like everything is great all the time. Those are 2 pretty hard choices to be left with. And sometimes you feel shame either way, no matter which one you choose. You may feel like you have suppressed emotions, which we know increase physiological stress on the body. And you may feel more isolation or other relationship problems. And that's because it's impossible to relate to others if you aren't free to express yourself, to be seen, and to be heard. And so I want to break these three concepts down a little. Brene Brown is kind of the leading researcher on shame, and she writes some pretty incredible works on shame and then also bravery and vulnerability as an aspect of bravery. So if you haven't read any of her works, I do recommend her. She defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore we are unworthy of love and belonging. She goes on to say that shame is never helpful or productive. Shame is, in fact, different than guilt. Guilt can sometimes serve a purpose. Sometimes we use guilt as a reflective emotion to know that we could have done better, or that we want to do better in the future. But shame never really has a place. So if someone's making you feel shameful, then it's probably not a healthy situation. And hopefully we can talk about some ways to avoid that in the future. Suppressed emotions are important to talk about because we have a fair amount of evidence through research studies that show us that when people are allowed to outwardly express their emotions through words, facial expressions, and even tears, then their physiological signs of stress in the body actually decrease. So in other words, if you cry or yell or express what feels bad or sad in a situation, you're doing your body good by kind of getting that stress out of the body. And on the contrary, if you're suppressing and you're not allowed to express what you're truly feeling and you're holding back tears and you're holding back words, you're housing that stress in your body. And that leads to physiological changes that can have negative impacts on your health, on your cardiovascular health, and your mental health, even leading to things like chronic pain. So we know that it's very important to not suppress emotions. And then isolation. Isolation is so detrimental to health and well-being that in the literature, it's even quoted as being fatal. We know that in the general population, isolation leads to an increased risk of developing coronary artery disease and stroke, and also dementia and depression. And certainly things like anxiety and increased costs of healthcare. So there are many deleterious effects of being isolated. And so if you're already part of a group of people who has to be a little bit isolated from time to time, such as if you've had BMT and you have to be isolated for your health, and then you add a pandemic on top of that and all of the world events, it's a little hard to know what you can do to safely combat isolation because we've already talked about social media, and sometimes technology can go both ways, and you have to be a little bit careful and mindful of noticing how that's impacting your mental health. But there are ways to use technology effectively to combat isolation. Thank goodness for things like FaceTime and Zoom and Skype and all the ways in which we can at least see people's expressions and connect with people. But there are other safe ways to connect. We have masks, we have barriers, we have distance, we're lucky that it's summertime and we have some, the option of outdoors and distance gatherings and backyards and front yards. And talking to neighbors over the fence. But if you're feeling isolated, I want to empower you to really reach out to your healthcare team. There are so many advances in telehealth going on right now that even if you think there's no one to talk to or no way to get help for this, I don't want to go to the doctor's office to talk about an increase in anxiety I'm having because that would expose me to risk. I just want to make the point that telehealth is coming a long way, and you can reach out to us, and many both medical providers and mental health providers are able to see you through telehealth visits and to help kind of talk through, even if you need to sort out what is normal versus what might I want to be treated for because this anxiety or depression or whatever it is feeling a little unmanageable. And then, another way to safely combat isolation is to find some meaning and purpose in this time of increased isolation. And I don't mean to say that you all have to become artisanal bread bakers or have some extravagant hobby that comes out of this sheltering in place, but I've heard wonderful stories of families who are just spending more time together, you know, whether it's doing more cooking or having family game night or having regular Zoom meetings. I know with myself, my family and I, we live in many different states anyway, but somehow all of a sudden with COVID-19, we've had family Zoom meetings, which we never had before. And it's like, we're kind of always physically distant. So I don't know why we didn't think of doing this sooner, but that's sort of a good thing that's come out of this, is just the aha moment to use these technologies in a different way. So think about the ways in which you can pluck some meaning and purpose out of your individual situation. Just, you know, small impactful things, not big moving mountain kind of things. So, you know, in general, my advice for you is to stay safe, work with your healthcare team, seek support not only for your physical health during this time, but for your mental and emotional well-being. Really tune in. Remember to recalibrate, reassess, refocus. That may be on a weekly basis, a daily basis, an hourly basis. I can't emphasize enough how listening to your own body and your own emotions is the most important part of taking care of yourself. And then when something doesn't feel right, speak up and seek support. It's also important to seek support within your communities that kind of get what you're going through. So maybe the rest of the world can't possibly understand what it feels like to have a compromised immune system right now. And even me working with all of you for many years now, I get it more than most people get it, but I still haven't lived in your shoes. So it's important that you seek support from those who know exactly what it's like to be in your shoes. And you have that really wonderful community here. And I know a lot of you have, subsets of that community where you get support, and other online communities. I like this quote that also came from the It's Okay to Not Be Okay article that says, positivity doesn't need to be toxic. A body of research finds that cultivating a positive outlook can boost immunity, lower stress, and even lengthen lifespans. So then you're probably wondering, you told us not to be toxic, have toxic positivity, but now you're saying we need to be positive. How do we kind of balance those two needs? So a bit of advice I have to leave you with on how to have a positive outlook is to cultivate a real and genuine reason to feel positive. To find good in a situation, and finding positivity doesn't mean that it has to be this outward expression of joy and jumping up and down. We know from the literature that everyone has a different preset, so don't have a preconceived notion of what it means to find good in a situation, or that it has to be jumping up and down happiness. Good is just the absence of those negative emotions, but labels of good and bad are subjective. And so, find good as you define good, and don't have an undue pressure on yourself for what good is. One way that we know that you can cultivate some of this positive outlook is through gratitude. And that's very well researched. You've probably heard me talk about that in the past, if you've ever heard me talk at all, because I'm a big fan of gratitude practice, because it is so evidence-based. And we know that as human beings, our brains are hardwired for negativity. And gratitude is the best surefire way to kind of combat some of that hardwiring for negativity. And unfortunately, it takes about 3 or 4 good things or grateful things to kind of combat a negative thought in our brains, because we just, from an evolutionary standpoint, we want to gravitate towards the negative or the bad. But it's important to know that as you cultivate a gratitude practice, it has to be a fairly structured practice. It's not just having the attitude of gratitude or that kind of toxic positivity, like #grateful behind every picture you take, but a real sense of either speaking out loud to your inner circle, the people you love, what you're grateful for, going around the dinner table at night is one simple practice, or writing it down. I'm a big fan of writing it down. So a gratitude journal has a lot of evidence behind it. You can write this, 3 things you're grateful for, either at the beginning of each day or at the end of each day. I like that method because it gives you something to go back and refer to on the really hard days where maybe you're having a hard time coming up with something to be grateful for. And even if you can't write 3 new things, you can go back and you can read the things that you were grateful for on the easier days. And you can identify themes. Sometimes we don't even realize what the best parts of our life are, but if something makes it into your top 3 day after day, then it kind of can be an aha moment of, wow, I really value my relationship with that person. They have shown up for me day after day. And then that can lead to more good feelings and more noticing, and maybe some even reciprocity with letting that other person know how grateful you are for them. And then finally, the third practice I'll mention is some families like to keep a gratitude jar. And so writing it down on a slip of paper, what you're grateful for, and putting it in some kind of a container that's accessible. And then you can have different creative ways of pulling those out and reading them at times when you're all together with family, or when you just need to walk by and have a little bit of inspiration. So there's really no right or wrong way to do it. The most important thing is to do it regularly, and in a structured way that kind of triggers your brain to it being an important practice, an important part of your day. Importantly, though, when we talk about having a positive outlook, I want to mention that having a positive outlook does not mean denying yourself negative feelings. That's never a part of cultivating a positive outlook. It's important to notice any feeling that you have, to allow it to exist, listen to it, kind of tune into it, work with it, and work through it. And part of that is just learning how to know about yourself and what your needs are and what helps when you're feeling different emotions. And that can change on a daily basis. But the example that I always give is, if you're feeling particularly sad or anger or grief, it's often really hard to sit still with those feelings for many of us. And so sometimes doing something that's movement-based or creativity-based, so whether that be exercise or being in nature or gardening, or if you're an artist, artistic expression is a really important way to work through a feeling and work with it and not be fighting it, but maybe you're expressing it. And sometimes just in expressing it, it starts to diffuse a little bit and maybe something positive comes out of it. But it's really more about the process and not having an expectation or pressure on yourself to have this amazing outcome as you work through a feeling. And even the label of good feelings and negative feelings is a little difficult to work through, because a feeling is just a feeling and it doesn't really need a qualifier as of good or bad. Part of mindfulness is not placing judgment on the things that we feel, just allowing them, noticing them, and then learning from them and moving forward. I like also this bit of wisdom that came out of the article and also comes from a woman who happens to be my mentor. She says in the article that someone who's experiencing these overwhelming feelings of sadness, you can't just expect them to flip a switch or, become jolly all of a sudden and just get out of that negative feeling. So what toxic positivity does is it refuses to acknowledge the challenges of that individual. And that's really inauthentic, and that doesn't build resilience, and it doesn't build relationships. In fact, it does the opposite. It can damage them over time. So, this quote is simply to give you permission that you're not expected to not feel sad, and you're not expected to just bounce out of it. We know that different personalities and different brain chemistries experience life differently, and not everyone can simply adopt that kind of happy-go-lucky positive outlook. And so asking people who don't have that same preset as you to deny those feelings is really damaging. So I don't think that anyone in this group does that to others. I worry that this group maybe experiences that. And so I want to empower you to know that denying negative feelings isn't a good coping mechanism. And we know that from a lot of evidence base. There's a study here that was done in 2012 in Australia that found people who followed the social expectations about feeling happy actually felt sad more frequently and more intensely. So don't hold yourself to any set standard of what is normal. And if you have young children, it's never too soon to start letting children know that it's okay and healthy to be angry and to be sad and to express those feelings. The goal of life is not to go through life on autopilot. The goal of life is to really indulge in all of the feelings and emotions and learn to make sense of them and work through them. This infographic on the screen here is something that it's very easily Googleable. You can find a lot of these infographics on how to turn toxic positivity into messages of more validation and hope. And so I put this here to encourage this group to share this, share this with those in your circle, share it on your social media, share it on your Caring Bridge pages. Get it in the hands of people that mean well and want to support you and don't have the right words, because even if you know that someone is just using one of these phrases of validation and hope because you've handed them this infographic and they know that that's what they should say now instead of the toxic positivity thing, it still feels better to hear the phrases on the left-hand side and the phrases on the right-hand side. So in closing, the message I want to leave for my beloved FAA families is that I see you during this difficult time. I know that what is hard for all of society right now is even harder for your family. And I know how many daily challenges and decisions and, just tasks you're left to think about to keep yourselves and your families whole and healthy. And they're infinitely more than, the rest of society. I'm staying home and encouraging others to stay home as much as possible to keep this world a safer place for all of you. And in the meantime, I think you are the strongest and bravest group of people I know, and I am inspired by all of you. So thank you for inviting me into your space, and I am really looking forward to interacting with all of you during the panel time.